There are some stories that start with small misunderstandings and end with lawsuits. But this one began with a ranch so vast it stretched farther than the eye could see, and an arrogance so deep it could swallow reason whole. The man at the center of it all had spent 25 years turning 200 acres of scrub and rock into a sprawling, self-sufficient paradise. Rolling pastures, a lake carved from his own sweat and bulldozers, solar panels, barns that gleamed like they'd been painted yesterday. The ranch wasn't just land, it was legacy, labor, and livelihood. And yet, one ordinary morning, he woke up to find it wasn't his anymore. The first clue came as a letter. Plain envelope, HOA logo at the top, nothing special. He almost threw it away. The ranch technically fell under a local rural homeowners association, though it had never interfered with him before. He paid his small annual dues for road maintenance, signed whatever papers they sent, and kept to himself. But this letter was different. The wording was cold, final, and absurd. It stated that due to non-payment of delinquent association fees, the HOA had seized ownership rights of his property. Not a portion, not a lien, the entire ranch. The letter even included an invoice, 1,200 acres, transferred to the HOA's trust, pursuant to board decision and county filing. He thought it was a scam. A prank, maybe, until the county clerk confirmed the nightmare. The HOA had filed documents of forfeiture, and they were now listed as owners of record. At first, disbelief. Then fury. How could an HOA possibly own what they didn't pay for? He'd never missed a payment in his life. But as he pulled old receipts, he noticed something. The dues invoices had changed formatting about a year ago. New logo, new address, new treasurer's name. The association had quietly merged with another, and under that merger, they'd created new special assessments hidden deep in legal text. Assessments he never received because the notices had gone to a post office box he didn't even know existed. It wasn't just incompetence. It was fraud, slow, deliberate, and sealed with bureaucratic indifference. He called, he emailed, he wrote letters. The HOA didn't care. They claimed all procedures were followed per covenant. When he went to the county recorder's office, they pointed to the signature on the forfeiture filing. It was his, except it wasn't. A crude forgery, copied from a deed he'd signed years earlier. The ink was a different shade, the signature warped, but there it was. Official, stamped, recorded. He could have sued. Maybe he should have. But lawsuits take time, and time was what they used against him. Within weeks, for sale signs began appearing along the highway bordering his land. The HOA had subdivided the ranch, his ranch, into parcels. Developers were already moving in. He watched as fences went up, survey flags dotted his fields, and trucks drove over the dirt road he'd built with his own two hands. Neighbors whispered about it at the feed store. How could an HOA do that? They asked. Can they really just take it? And the ugly truth was, they could, if no one stopped them. The system, as broken as it was, allowed associations to foreclose on properties over unpaid fees. Most cases involved houses in gated communities, not 200-acre ranches. But the paperwork didn't care about scale. To the law, it was all the same line item. Days bled into weeks. He stayed up late reading statutes, county codes, and HOA bylaws until his vision blurred. The deeper he dug, the uglier it got. The board members, the same ones who had voted to seize his property, were tied to a small real estate firm in town. That firm had just secured a development rights contract with the county for a new luxury subdivision. The subdivision's footprint? The center of his ranch. It was never about unpaid dues. It was about land. They thought he'd roll over. They thought he'd disappear quietly, another casualty of paperwork and politics. But they underestimated him. He wasn't just angry, he was methodical. If the HOA could twist the rules to take his land, he could twist them back. He began collecting documents. Every filing, every email, every budget note from the HOA's annual reports. He learned their structure, their hierarchy, their weaknesses. The association wasn't some faceless corporate entity. It was a nonprofit corporation, registered with the state, with shareholders and voting rights. And like any corporation, it could fall apart if someone bought up enough of its voting shares. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous. But then he discovered the key. Several homeowners in the HOA's jurisdiction were fed up too. The board had been hiking fees, issuing arbitrary fines, even repossessing smaller properties over trivial amounts. Many members were behind on dues, not out of neglect, but out of protest. The HOA, drowning in debt, had been quietly preparing to auction off liens and even sell its own assets. All it would take was a few precise moves, some patient bidding, some legal filings, and he could own the very organization that stole from him. He played the long game. No rage-filled confrontations, no threats, just quiet, strategic patience. He moved his assets into a trust, hired a friend who specialized in foreclosure auctions, and began tracking the HOA's public notices. They posted an upcoming auction, routine, unnoticed by most. But buried in that listing, he found it. The HOA's own administrative office and voting interest were being liquidated to cover operational deficits. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for. He didn't tell a soul. Not his neighbors, not his family, not the local gossip who asked too many questions. He attended the auction under a holding company's name. The bids were small at first. A few investors, some opportunists. No one really cared about a defunct HOA with bad press. But he cared, and when the gavel fell, his company owned it. The HOA that had stolen his ranch now belonged entirely to him. But ownership on paper wasn't enough. He wanted justice, and he wanted it to echo. He wanted every smug board member, every corrupt treasurer, every lawyer who had signed off on the theft to feel what he felt. To lose everything, legally, publicly, and permanently. The first step was understanding just how deep their corruption went. Because when he opened the HOA's books, he didn't just find evidence of fraud, he found evidence of something much bigger. Something that would make the entire county sit up and take notice. And as he stared at the rows of transactions, the shell companies, the quietly laundered money flowing through fake maintenance contracts, he realized something chilling. The ranch wasn't the first property they had stolen. It was just the biggest. He leaned back in his chair, surrounded by files and dust and the low hum of his determination. They had taken his land through the system. Now he would take their system entirely, and this time every move would be 100% legal. The auction was exactly the sort of small-town event people skipped for yard sales and county fairs. A bare-bones listing in a legal notice section. A single line among dozens. Nothing flashy. That was the point. If you wanted to hide a takeover, you hid it in plain sight between probate sales and delinquent tax liens. He smiled at the irony. The very bureaucracy that had been weaponized against him now handed him a lever to pull the whole thing over. He arrived early, not as a man with a vendetta, but as a calm presence with a plan. The county hall smelled of coffee and old paper, folding chairs, a podium, a clerk with a bored expression. There were a handful of bidders, retirees, a local investor with grease under his fingernails, a couple of developers who had already scouted parts of his former land. No one seemed to take the auction seriously. After all, who wanted a broken HOA? Who wanted the headache of inherited lawsuits and disgruntled homeowners? The room underestimated the stakes the way predators underestimate a wounded animal. His proxy bided time. He let the other bidders bleed their interest. When the price hit a certain number, far below what the board hoped would silence dissent, he raised his hand. The gavel thundered, and in a single minute, the county clerk read the words. Sold to. His corporate veil was lifted only enough to satisfy law. The true name behind the bid remained his private victory. He sat there as if watching a play, but his heart pounded like a war drum. The HOA that had taken his ranch, that had filed forged signatures and changed mailing addresses, was now, by state statute, under his control. Owning the HOA was different from owning land. It was a legal organism with bylaws, accounts, records, and liabilities. It had power, dark, procedural power, but it also had Achilles' heels. He had prepared for that. Within hours, he filed the necessary paperwork to install a temporary board, invoking clauses that allowed an incoming proprietor to place a trustee in charge pending audits. The county clerk stamped each form as if this was a routine corporate reshuffle. The routine, he had learned, was where the rot thrived. News spread slower than it would on social media, but it spread. Phone calls came in, some tentative, some venomous. The old board, the ones who had orchestrated the seizure of his ranch, were blindsided. It took them a whole day to process that the entity they'd used as a weapon was now a sword in his hand. Panic set in like a fog. They held emergency meetings behind closed doors, whispered into cups of coffee, called attorneys who specialized in damage control. Their first instinct was to smear, to distract, to manufacture chaos. They tried to claim procedural errors in the auction, to question the legitimacy of the bidder. The county had already logged everything. The gavel had fallen. The clock ticked. He moved quickly, because legal power without action is only potential. The temporary board voted quietly, formally, to suspend any pending sales, approvals, or permits that the old board had issued in the last 6 months. Developers who thought they had green-lit lots on his former pastures found themselves in limbo. Bulldozers idled like beasts without commands. He placed an immediate freeze on all association accounts, a forensic accountant already waiting to untangle the knotted ledger. The objective wasn't to destroy the HOA's value. The objective was to expose the theft that had been engineered through it. Word leaked out to neighbors and the small circle of homeowners in the association's jurisdiction. Many of them had been furious with the old board for years. Fines levied for trivial landscaping, fines for unauthorized chicken coops, threats for painting front doors the wrong color, petty tyrannies that add up. For some, he was a savior. For others, a new unknown to be wary of. The local message boards lit up with a brand of outrage usually reserved for city council scandals and viral videos. Someone made a meme. Someone else recorded a shaky phone clip of a former board member pacing behind tinted windows. In the echo chamber of small-town outrage, the story was irresistible. He expected the board to fight back. And they did, but not with daring-do. They launched procedural appeals, filed injunctions, and waved ancient bylaws like talismans. The attorneys were quick to threaten countersuits, breach of fiduciary duty, improper takeover, bad faith acquisition. Those suits had a rhythm. They cost money, they delayed action, and they banked on the truth getting buried under legal fees. He never intended to win a war of attrition with the old board. He intended to win by making the battlefield public. Transparency was his weapon. He made sure homeowners received clean, incontrovertible copies of meeting minutes, expense reports, and vendor contracts. He released redacted, but damning, ledgers that showed payments routed through shell companies, maintenance contracts that paid twice as much as they should have, and invoices for security that led directly to a single real estate firm. He didn't shout. He presented spreadsheets, dates, receipts, simple, digestible evidence that any reasonable person could follow. The difference between rumor and proof is a few columns of numbers and a couple of highlighted signatures. The more he revealed, the more uneasy the old board became. One by one, Vendors who had been complicit, or at least convenient, began to distance themselves. Some filed affidavits confirming that invoices had been altered. An accountant who had once nodded approvingly at the board's creative bookkeeping now testified that practices were unusual and outside standard nonprofit accounting. Those words, hedged and careful, sounded like thunder to people who prized appearances more than integrity. He also used the tools the old board had used against him. Notices, bylaws, homeowner votes. He scheduled an emergency general meeting. He sent proper notices to every member, using addresses verified by the county, not the post office box that had been the HOA's dark hole of communication. The meeting's agenda was straightforward: elect a new board, authorize audits, and vote on a resolution to rescind any transfer of property that had been achieved through the HOA's questionable actions. It was a quiet, procedural leveling of the playing field. The old board had weaponized process. He would reclaim it. On the day of the meeting, the room was fuller than it had any right to be. People who had stopped paying dues in protest came, and people who had feared retaliation came, and people who had once thought the HOA was just a paperwork thing realized it could ruin lives. He didn't speak like a sermonizer. His statements were delivered through careful packets of evidence and motions that any homeowner, irrespective of education, could vote to approve. When the ballots were counted, the result was decisive. The homeowners, given clarity and proof, voted to install the new board and to commission a full forensic audit. The board's reaction shifted from legal theater to personal rancor. They hurled accusations in the comment sections of local forums. They called the sheriff to complain about disturbances. They pressed complaints with the state's nonprofit regulators. Each move was predictable, cataloged, and ultimately ineffective, because the evidence was public and the law, when applied openly, was not on their side. Meanwhile, as the audit began to unravel transactions dating back years, he discovered something more than petty graft. He found an elaborate cycle of leverage the old board had used, coercing vulnerable homeowners into selling small parcels for pennies on the dollar, then filing liens that justified foreclosure for non-payment, then flipping those parcels to developers connected to the same real estate firm. It was a cycle of extraction disguised by legalese. The township had missed it. The county had missed it. Even neighbors had missed it, because it was orchestrated quietly and ruthlessly. He felt a peculiar satisfaction watching the puzzle come apart. This was surgical, not vengeful. He wasn't interested in petty humiliation. He wanted the system fixed and the stolen assets returned. He began to map restitution plans, identify banks that had unknowingly financed development on illicitly obtained lots, and draft proposals to return misappropriated funds to the homeowners who had lost them. There was complexity ahead: bank negotiations, repair of title issues, and the tacit moral labor of convincing people that the law could protect them, not just exploit them. There were moments of doubt, brief and human. The path forward was baked in legal nuance and required temperate pragmatism. He also knew the showmanship that thrived in small towns, the urge to frame every victory as a scandalous moral triumph, the tendency for people to demand theatrical punishments. He resisted that, working instead to build a legal scaffolding that would make the outcome durable. But there were private pleasures too. When the county zoning office called to confirm that permits for the subdivision were now paused pending audit findings, he allowed himself a slow, private grin. Bulldozers idling, developers cooling their heels, small delays that felt like echoes of justice. The old board's phone lines were ringing off the hook with angry callers. They were the ones who had once rung his phone with threats. That image of him calmly reviewing spreadsheets while they spun felt like a quiet reclamation of dignity. The auction had been the hinge. Ownership of the HOA was a lever. What he was about to do with it would bend consequences toward accountability. He had bought a weapon the other side had forged, and he planned to use it to return what was stolen and to ensure it could never happen again. The road ahead would require patience, legal acumen, and a willingness to make enemies of people. By the time the new board settled into place, the air around the HOA headquarters carried the smell of change. Dust from boxes cracked open after years of neglect. The faint metallic tang of old filing cabinets dragged into light. The building had once been a symbol of control. Tidy, polished, and sterile. Its walls lined with framed certificates that meant nothing but power. Now it was a crime scene of paper. Each file, each receipt, was a breadcrumb leading backward through a labyrinth of corruption. He had spent his life dealing in tangible things. Fences, cattle, soil that spoke beneath his boots. Paper had never been his world. But now it was his battlefield. And the more pages he turned, the more the pattern emerged. The HOA's crimes weren't a single act of theft. They were a culture of quiet exploitation. He discovered overlapping ledgers, maintenance projects billed twice, even expense reports claiming meetings that had never happened. There were missing funds, ghost contractors, and a curious trend. Every time land changed hands, the same real estate trust appeared somewhere in the background. The old board had been running a shell game for years, disguising theft as governance. The new board members, ordinary homeowners with day jobs, were unprepared for the scale. They came in expecting to clean up accounting. Instead, they found a paper trail that snaked into county offices, bank loans, and even the sheriff's department's own land holdings. He could feel their unease grow as the evidence mounted. This wasn't just an HOA scandal. It was a quiet ecosystem of greed that touched almost every institution nearby. And at the heart of it was his stolen ranch, carved into parcels and pre-sold to developers who had no idea their title was tainted. The audit became their anchor. A forensic firm, hired with funds recovered from canceled contracts, started piecing together timelines. Each week brought new revelations. One accountant uncovered a series of cashier's checks made out to a board member's spouse. Another found an entire subdivision, 20 acres, transferred using forged homeowner signatures as approvals. The crimes were old, deliberate, and bureaucratically elegant. They had counted on no one ever looking this closely. The deeper they dug, the more pushback came. Anonymous letters began arriving at the HOA office, threatening to let sleeping dogs lie. A truck was parked outside for hours at night, headlights off. Someone hacked the HOA's website, replacing meeting notices with a message that read, "You can't undo what's already done." Small-town intimidation, the sort meant to wear down resolve through fear and exhaustion. But he was past intimidation. They had already taken everything from him once. Now there was nothing left to lose. He began documenting everything. Every threat, every unexplained glitch, every missing file. He knew fear could only live in the dark, and exposure was sunlight. The more he published, quietly, methodically, the more their leverage crumbled. Homeowners who once shrugged at HOA politics began demanding answers. Reporters from nearby counties caught wind of the story, smelling blood in the water. The narrative shifted from rancher versus HOA to something far larger, small-town corruption hidden behind property rights. Meanwhile, he kept his focus on the mechanics. If he let rage steer him, he would stumble. Instead, he treated it like ranch work, fence by fence, acre by acre. Every irregular payment was logged. Every suspicious contract matched with a name. The accountant's findings became maps, lines connecting people, showing how board members had bought distressed properties through dummy companies, then flipped them under the HOA's own jurisdiction for profit-sharing maintenance. It was self-dealing disguised as administration. The county officials began to take notice, too late to appear innocent. They sent auditors of their own, hoping to appear proactive. But the damage was already public. When he presented the documents at a town hall, thick binders filled with stamped evidence, the room went silent. No shouting, no chaos, Just disbelief. These were people who had lived under this system for years, fined for the color of a shed door or the placement of a mailbox, never realizing the people enforcing those rules were pocketing hundreds of thousands in illicit gain. That silence was power. In that silence, something shifted. Fear gave way to collective anger. And with that anger came allies. Local homeowners began offering their own records. A retired treasurer from the HOA's early days dropped off a box of old budgets. A bank teller, recognizing familiar names from loan applications, quietly slipped copies of public filings through proper channels. Each piece of information was a nail in the coffin. Each discovery peeled back the illusion that this was a small-time scam. It wasn't. It was systemic. By the fourth week of the audit, they had traced nearly $2 million in diverted funds over a decade. He had expected theft, but not embezzlement on that scale. And every transaction pointed back to the same circle. The old board, their real estate firm, and the county zoning commissioner who had rubber-stamped every development permit on his former ranch. The county, in effect, had sanctioned the theft. They hadn't known, perhaps, but they hadn't cared to ask either. The more the light shone, the louder the panic became. The former HOA president, now facing scrutiny, tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that the ranch foreclosure had been procedural confusion. But the paperwork told a different story. There were internal memos about acquisition strategy, risk mitigation, and transferring assets before litigation. It wasn't confusion, it was conspiracy. When he finally walked the property lines of what used to be his ranch, now frozen by court order, he felt the bitter satisfaction of standing on land that had once been stolen and now stood in limbo. Not yet his again, but no longer theirs. Survey markers fluttered in the wind like white flags. The developer's machinery sat still, rusting slightly under the sun. Time was on his side now. He didn't move to reclaim the land yet. That would come later, once the courts were ready. For now, his focus was dismantling the machinery that had made this possible. He wanted it impossible for anyone to ever weaponize an HOA like this again. He drafted new bylaws, ones that required quarterly audits, transparent online records, and member votes for any property actions. He installed term limits for the board and mandatory third-party oversight for contracts. In doing so, he created a blueprint, an anti-corruption model other associations could replicate. But behind the progress was a shadow. The old guard wasn't finished. Someone had leaked the new board's audit findings early, twisting them in local news columns to imply his takeover was the scandal, that he had manipulated the system to seize control. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same tactics they had used to justify stealing his land were now being recycled to question his legitimacy. The smear campaign was predictable. Accusations of greed, conspiracy, revenge. They tried to paint him as a villain rewriting history. It almost worked. Almost. Until one of their own broke ranks. The HOA's former secretary, a quiet woman long overlooked, came forward with her private archive of emails. She had been keeping records for years, frightened but diligent, unsure who to trust. Her emails showed the real board conversations, the planning, the votes to forge signatures, the decision to move quickly before legal pushback. It was the smoking gun, the paper trail that connected intention to action. He read them all in silence, the same way one studies weather reports before a storm. There it was, the evidence that would turn whispers into prosecutions. He turned them over to the authorities, methodically, without theatrics. His satisfaction wasn't loud, it was patient. He had no need to shout victory. The documents would speak louder than any monologue. By the time the story reached regional news outlets, the narrative was set. Rancher exposes HOA corruption, buys it back, and uncovers county-wide fraud. It spread fast. People shared it online, half in disbelief, half in awe. And while he stayed out of the interviews, His quiet composure became part of the legend. The man who lost everything to paperwork and won it back using the same system. But the story wasn't over. Ownership of the HOA gave him leverage, not closure. The county was about to intervene, and the developers were preparing lawsuits of their own, desperate to salvage investments now frozen by investigation. The next phase wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about survival through precision. Paper battles fought in courtrooms instead of pastures. He stood at the edge of his land that evening, the autumn air heavy with dust and cold. For the first time in a long while he felt not anger, but clarity. He understood now what the HOA had truly taken from him. It wasn't land, or money, or even pride. It was trust. Trust in systems, in fairness, in decency. But he had found something stronger to replace it. Control. Control earned, legal, and absolute. The wind cut across the fields, rustling through the empty lots where homes were never built. The ranch, for now, remained silent, caught between theft and restitution. But that silence carried promise. The real reckoning was coming. Power never disappears. It shifts. For weeks, the balance of that small county had tilted toward accountability, the weight of truth pulling the curtain off the corruption that had long ruled from behind meeting minutes and property filings. But as the saying went, power hates a vacuum. The moment the old board fell, the county officials who had ignored them began circling like vultures over fresh carrion. They were frightened, and frightened people rarely acted with integrity. At first, the county played coy. They issued carefully worded statements about investigative cooperation and procedural integrity. They promised transparency, though none of their meetings were open to the public. The zoning commissioner, same one who had signed every fraudulent parcel approval, took an unexpected leave of absence. His office was locked, and his assistant claimed he had medical reasons. Everyone knew it was code for damage control. But then came the first real strike. One morning, a notice arrived at the HOA office. The envelope bore the county seal. Inside, a formal declaration. The county intended to reassess and possibly dissolve the HOA due to irregularities in corporate governance and acquisition. On paper, it was framed as oversight. In truth, it was an attempt to dismantle the very organization that now held the evidence against them. Dissolving the HOA would scatter the documentation, invalidate claims, and muddy ownership trails. It was the county's legal sleight of hand, burning the house down to hide the crime. He read the letter slowly, twice, and then set it down without a word. The county wanted to erase the board's existence, erase his position, erase everything he had uncovered. They were playing chess while pretending it was cleanup, but he knew their tactics now. Bureaucracy could be both shield and sword, and he had spent months learning how to wield it better than they ever had. The first counterstrike was procedural. He filed an injunction within hours, asserting the HOA's rights as a private corporate entity. The county couldn't dissolve a nonprofit without due process or member consent. The motion was clean, cold, and supported by statute, the same legal foundation they had once used to steal from him. The county's move had been aggressive, but it was clumsy. They had underestimated his command of their language. Still, the notice was only the opening shot. Within days, county inspectors began appearing on HOA-managed properties. They cited code violations, environmental infractions, improper waste disposal, all fabricated, all designed to justify seizure under the guise of regulation. It was harassment dressed as enforcement. Trucks rolled down gravel roads that hadn't seen a county vehicle in years. Neighbors whispered about retaliation. He knew better. It wasn't whispers, it was strategy. He kept meticulous records of every encounter. Photos, timestamps, badge numbers, names. The HOA office became a fortress of documentation. He sent daily reports to his attorney, who in turn forwarded them to the state oversight agency. Every move the county made, he logged. Each unjustified citation, each unwarranted inspection, it all built toward a picture too obvious to deny. Meanwhile, the audit continued, and its findings were impossible to bury. The forensic team traced funds from the HOA directly into a slush account controlled by a development committee chaired by the county commissioner himself. The implications were staggering. It meant the county hadn't been merely complicit, they had profited. The luxury subdivision built atop his ranch wasn't just corruption, it was money laundering disguised as progress. When the local paper published the findings, the county's mask slipped. The commissioner went on record calling the report inflammatory fiction, claiming it was part of a disgruntled former landowner's vendetta. The old story, always the same, paint the whistleblower as obsessed, irrational, unstable, but this time it didn't land. The evidence was public, the bank statements undeniable. Public opinion turned like a tide. For the first time, the quiet residents who had always feared their HOA, or the officials behind it, felt power shift in their favor. They began attending meetings. They demanded answers, records, resignations. Transparency, once dismissed as tedious, became the rallying cry of the entire township. The county's silence only made them angrier. The more pressure mounted, the more desperate the county's countermeasures became. They ordered property reappraisals across the HOA's jurisdiction, claiming tax discrepancies. It was punishment disguised as oversight. Bills skyrocketed overnight. Homeowners who had supported him suddenly faced financial strain. The county hoped to turn them against him, to make them see his crusade as the cause of their pain. For a moment, it almost worked. Frustration brewed. Meetings grew tense. People wanted justice, but they also wanted peace. And peace rarely coexists with justice. He understood that tension. He'd lived it. But he reminded them what was at stake. He reminded them of the letters, the forged signatures, the land stolen not just from him, but from anyone who had ever trusted a signature was sacred. The crowd listened, uneasy but loyal. They were tired of fear disguised as order. Then came the subpoena. The county's legal department demanded full access to all HOA audit materials, ostensibly for review, but clearly an attempt to seize evidence. Their goal was to bury it under procedural custody, to drown it in red tape. But he had anticipated that too. The data had already been duplicated, encrypted, and stored in multiple off-site locations. The county could seize boxes, but not truth. And truth, once freed, began to spread. Larger news outlets picked up the story. County under fire for HOA land seizure scandal. Reporters arrived with cameras, questions, and a hunger for spectacle. The commissioner's confident tone faltered on live television. Every time he tried to deflect, the journalists redirected to the ranch, the heart of the story. The symbol of everything they'd taken and everything he'd reclaimed. When state investigators finally announced a formal inquiry, it was almost anticlimactic. Everyone had known it was coming. The county courthouse buzzed with quiet panic. Files disappeared overnight. Hard drives were wiped. Staffers resigned in clusters. What had once been a machine of quiet control was collapsing under its own weight. He didn't celebrate. He simply noted the dates, the names, the timing. Each desperate act was evidence of guilt. But the fight wasn't over. The county, even cornered, still had influence. They filed a motion to suspend the HOA's management authority during the investigation, citing public interest. It was a move that would neutralize his control and stall restitution efforts indefinitely. The court hearing was set for early morning, the kind of quiet proceeding they hoped would slip unnoticed. He arrived before dawn. The courthouse smelled of rain and disinfectant. The county's attorneys sat smugly at their table, expecting victory through exhaustion. But when the judge asked for the HOA's representation, he stood with a folder in hand. Not anger, not theatrics, just preparation. Inside were the documents the county had filed months earlier, the forged transfer that had started everything, and the chain of evidence connecting it to their own bank accounts. He didn't need to speak much. The documents did the speaking. The courtroom, once a place that had failed him, became the stage where the system turned on itself. When the judge adjourned, the county's motion was denied. The HOA's control stood. The injunction against dissolution remained. The investigation would proceed independently. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed, eager for sound bites. He said nothing. Silence had always been his weapon. Instead, he walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps, watching as county officials scurried past him like insects avoiding light. They had thrown everything they had at him: power, regulation, fear, and still he stood. That night, back at the ranch, he looked over the property under the fading glow of the horizon. The grass was brittle from neglect, the fences weathered, but it was still there, unbroken, unyielding. He knew it wasn't truly his yet. Legal ownership would take months to restore, but spiritually, it was reclaimed. The county had struck back with all its weight, but all it had done was reveal its own rot. Every act of aggression only amplified the truth he had uncovered. And as the investigation widened, pulling in names far beyond the HOA, he realized this was no longer a story about revenge. It was about exposure, about systems built on arrogance meeting someone who refused to bow. And as he sat beneath the stars, listening to the faint rustle of the land he'd once called home, he knew one thing for certain. They could twist laws, they could forge signatures, they could weaponize fear, but they could never outlast patience. The reckoning had begun, and this time it was the county's turn to be afraid. Justice, when it comes, does not always arrive with sirens or speeches. Sometimes it moves quietly, like a slow tide returning to shore, covering every wound it left behind. Months had passed since the courtroom victory that stopped the county's dissolution attempt, and in that time the tide had turned entirely. What began as one man's fight against an HOA had become a statewide scandal, the kind whispered about in offices and debated in barber shops. The county's name had become shorthand for corruption, an emblem of arrogance undone by paperwork. The investigation unfolded like clockwork. State auditors combed through every account tied to the HOA, the county zoning department, and the development trust. The results were damning. Millions in misused funds, bribes disguised as consulting fees, property valuations manipulated to favor select buyers, all exposed in black and white. The old board members faced indictments. The zoning commissioner resigned before he could be removed. And the developers, the ones who had bet on stolen land, found their projects frozen indefinitely, their investments bleeding by the day. Through it all, he kept his silence. While others gave interviews and made statements, he worked. The HOA, under his control, had become more than an organization. It was a mechanism of repair. He directed the auditors, coordinated with attorneys, and guided restitution efforts. Properties wrongfully foreclosed upon were identified one by one. Paperwork was corrected, deeds restored. Every victim of the HOA's corruption received a letter, signed by his own hand, informing them their ownership had been reinstated. Free of charge, with public apology attached. The public began to call him the Quiet Avenger. He ignored the nickname, but he understood its appeal. People loved symbols, and his story had become one. The rancher who lost everything and won it back not with violence, but with law. Yet beneath the myth was a man who rarely slept. The work was endless, the details maddening. Even victory demanded maintenance. But for him, it was worth every hour. One morning, months after the first letter had arrived to steal his life, a new envelope came. This time it bore the seal of the state. Inside was a single sheet. Official notice that all fraudulent filings concerning his 1,200-acre ranch had been voided. Ownership reverted entirely to him. His name, once erased from the records, now stood restored. He sat for a long time at his desk, staring at that single line of text. Ownership. His. Legal. Final. The words carried the weight of everything he had endured. The fury, the doubt, the nights spent under courthouse fluorescents, reading laws not written for people like him. It was done. He had won. The next day, he drove out to the ranch alone. The roads were rougher now, weeds curling through cracks in the gravel. The land stretched before him as it always had, vast and indifferent. The barns stood like ghosts of the past, weathered but resolute. He parked near the old gate, the one the HOA had claimed as common access, and stepped out. The lock was rusted, the hinges squealed, but the air smelled the same. Earth and memory. Every step through the fields felt heavier, as if the land itself was testing him, asking whether he deserved it back. The lake he'd dug shimmered under the mid-morning sun, the surface rippled by a lazy breeze. Time had done its work on the ranch, but it hadn't broken it. The soil still held life. He knelt down, pressed his palm into the dirt, and felt the pulse of something steady and true. It was his again, but more importantly, it was free. As he walked the perimeter, he thought about everything that had brought him here. The HOA had believed they could bury theft under signatures. The county had believed they could silence truth with power. But both had underestimated the persistence of one person armed with patience and paper. The irony was beautiful. They had used bureaucracy as a weapon, and he had turned it back on them with precision sharp enough to cut through steel. Back in town, life had changed. The HOA, once a symbol of oppression, had become a model for reform. Other associations reached out, asking how to replicate his bylaws. State legislators drafted new protections against property seizure abuse. Transparency requirements expanded across counties. What began as personal revenge had become systemic reform. But beneath the accolades and legal victories, he remained quiet. He attended no rallies, gave no statements. He simply ran the HOA with integrity, ensuring every penny was accounted for, every decision documented. There was something poetic in it, ruling the very system that had tried to rule him. The irony was not lost on him, but it no longer felt like vengeance. It felt like duty. Occasionally, he would see one of the former board members around town, eyes lowered, hurrying past. Some were facing trial, others pleading out. A few had fled entirely. He didn't chase them. Their punishment was already in motion. The county, once smug and untouchable, was now under state supervision. The commissioner's office had been replaced by a transparency board, one that answered directly to voters. It was a small-town revolution, all born from one unlawful foreclosure. As winter crept across the plains, he began restoring the ranch piece by piece. New fencing, solar lines repaired, the barn roof patched. He hired back old hands, people who remembered when the land was alive with cattle and harvest. Work replaced resentment, routine replaced anger. The land, once a symbol of loss, became a symbol of endurance. One evening, while walking the property line, he stopped near a section where survey stakes still stood. Bright plastic flags left behind by the developers who had tried to divide it. He didn't pull them out. He left them there, a reminder. Every time the wind rustled them, He heard the whisper of what had been lost and regained. Word of his story continued to spread, morphing into something larger than truth. A legend about a rancher who bought an HOA just to take back his land. Online commentators exaggerated the details, adding drama and dialogue where none had been. He didn't correct them, let them tell it however they wanted. What mattered was that somewhere out there, someone might hear it and learn that systems could be beaten, that justice, slow and quiet, could still prevail. In the months that followed, he finalized the restitution plan. The HOA's remaining funds, recovered from frozen developer accounts, were redistributed to homeowners who had been wronged. The association's new charter included clauses that prevented foreclosures for unpaid dues without judicial oversight. It was, in essence, a Bill of Rights for homeowners, born from the ashes of abuse. On the anniversary of the day the first letter had arrived, he stood once more on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The sun rose over the hills, casting long light across the pastures. The land was whole again. He had thought victory would feel like triumph, but instead it felt like peace, a quiet, earned peace. He understood now that revenge had only been the spark. What had sustained him was something simpler, the belief that truth, when pursued with persistence, could outlast deceit. The HOA had taken his property through the law, and he had reclaimed it through the same law. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was procedural, patient, and absolute. The county would recover someday. The land would endure, and he would live on not as a victim, but as a custodian, a man who had seen the worst of systems and still believed in fixing them rather than burning them down. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and looked out at the horizon. The fields rolled endlessly. The fences gleamed, and somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of life returned to the soil. The wind carried a familiar whisper across the grass, a sound that once reminded him of loss, now transformed into the sound of reclamation. He had taken back what was his, not through defiance but through discipline. He had fought power with patience, corruption with clarity, and won. And as the morning light stretched across his 200 acres, he smiled quietly, knowing that every inch of land beneath him, every line in the deed, every blade of grass was his again, legally, completely and forever.